For Horses and a Sailor. By Jack London. Ha! Drive 4 horses. I wouldn't sit behind you not for $1,000 over them mountain roads. So said Henry, and he ought to have known, for he drives 4 horses himself. Said another Glen Ellen friend, what? London? He drive 4 horses. Can't drive one. And the best of it is that he was right. Even after managing to get a few hundred miles with my 4 horses, I don't know how to drive one. Just the other day, swinging down a steep mountain road and rounding an abrupt turn, I came full tilt on a horse and buggy being driven by a woman up the hill. We could not pass on the narrow road, where was only a foot to spare, and my horses did not know how to back, especially uphill. About 200 yards down the hill was a spot where we could pass. The driver of the buggy said she didn't dare back down because she was not sure of the brake. And as I didn't know how to tackle one horse, I didn't try it. So we unhitched her horse and backed down by hand. Which was very well, till it came to hitching the horse to the buggy again. She didn't know how. I didn't either, and I had depended on her knowledge. It took us about half an hour, with frequent debates and consultations, though it is an absolute certainty that never in its life was that horse hitched in that particular way. No, I can't harness up one horse. But I can 4, which compels me to back up again to get to my beginning. Having selected Sonoma Valley for our abiding place, Charmian and I decided it was about time we knew what we had in our own county and the neighboring ones. How to do it was the first question. Among our many weaknesses is the one of being old-fashioned. We don't mix with gasoline very well. And, as true sailors should, we naturally gravitate toward horses. Being one of those lucky individuals who carries his office under his hat, I should have to take a typewriter and a load of books along. This put saddle horses out of the running. Charmian suggested driving a span. She had faith in me, besides, she could drive a span herself. But when I thought of the many mountains to cross, and of crossing them for 3 months with a poor tired span, I vetoed the proposition and said we'd have to come back to gasoline after all. This she vetoed just as emphatically, and a deadlock obtained until I received inspiration. Why not drive 4 horses? I said. But you don't know how to drive 4 horses, was her objection. I threw my chest out and my shoulders back. What man has done, I can do, I proclaimed grandly. And please don't forget that when we sailed on the Snark I knew nothing of navigation, and that I taught myself as I sailed. Very well, she said. And there's faith for you. They shall be 4 saddle horses, and we'll strap our saddles on behind the rig. It was my turn to object. Our saddle horses are not broken to harness. Then break them. And what I knew about horses, much less about breaking them, was just about as much as any sailor knows. Having been kicked, bucked off, fallen over backward upon, and thrown out and run over, on very numerous occasions, I had a mighty vigorous respect for horses, but a wife's faith must be lived up to, and I went at it. King was a polo pony from St. Louis, and Prince a menigated love horse from Pasadena. The hardest thing was to get them to dig in and pull. They rollicked along on the levels and galloped down the hills, but when they struck an upgrade and felt the weight of the braking cart, they stopped and turned around and looked at me. But I passed them, and my troubles began. Milda was 14 years old, an unadulterated broncho, and in temperament was a combination of mule and jackrabbit blended equally. If you pressed your hand on her flank and told her to get over, she lay down on you. If you got her by the head and told her to back, she walked forward over you. And if you got behind her and shoved and told her to gid-ap, she sat down on you. Also, she wouldn't walk. For endless weary miles I strove with her, but never could I get her to walk a step. Finally, she was a manger glutton. No matter how near or far from the stable, when 6 o'clock came around she bolted for home and never missed the directest crossroad. Many times I rejected her. The fourth and most rejected horse of all was the outlaw. From the age of 3 to 7 she had defied all horsebreakers and broken a number of them. Then a long, lanky cowboy, with a 50-pound saddle and a Mexican bit had got her proud goat. I was the next owner. She was my favorite riding horse. Charmian said I'd have to put her in as a wheeler where I would have more control over her. Now Charmian had a favorite riding mare called Maid. I suggested Maid as a substitute. Charmian pointed out that my mare was a branded range horse, while hers was a near thoroughbred, and that the legs of her mare would be ruined forever if she were driven for 3 months. I acknowledged her mare's thoroughbredness, and at the same time defied her to find any thoroughbred with as small and delicately viciously pointed ears as my outlaw. She indicated Maid's exquisitely thin shin bone. I measured the outlaw's. It was equally thin, although, I insinuated, possibly more durable. This stabbed Charmian's pride. Of course her near thoroughbred Maid, carrying the blood of old Lexington, Moella, and a streak of the super-enduring Morgan, could run, walk, and work my unregistered outlaw into the ground, and that was the very precise reason why such a paragon of a saddle animal should not be degraded by harness. So it was that Charmian remained obdurate, until, one day, I got her behind the outlaw for a 40-mile drive. For every inch of those 40 miles the outlaw kicked and jumped, in between the kicks and jumps finding time and space in which to seize its teammate by the back of the neck and attempt to drag it to the ground. Another trick the outlaw developed during that drive was suddenly to turn at right angles in the traces and endeavor to put its teammate over the grade. Reluctantly and nobly did Charmian give in and consent to the use of Maid. The outlaw's shoes were pulled off, and she was turned out on range. Finally, the 4 horses were hooked to the Rigay Light Studebaker trap. With 2 hours and a half of practice, in which the excitement was not abated by several jack poles and numerous kicking matches, I announced myself as ready for the start. Came the morning, and Prince, who was to have been a wheeler with Maid, showed up with a badly kicked shoulder. He did not exactly show up, we had to find him, for he was unable to walk. His legs swelled and continually swelled during the several days we waited for him. Remained only the outlaw. In from pasture she came, shoes were nailed on, and she was harnessed into the wheel. Friends and relatives strove to press accident policies on me, but Charmian climbed up alongside, and Nokota got into the rear seat with the typewriter Nokota, who sailed cabin boy on the Snark for 2 years and who had shown himself afraid of nothing, not even of me and my amateur jamborees in experimenting with new modes of locomotion. And we did very nicely, thank you, especially after the first hour or so, during which time the outlaw had kicked about 50 various times, chiefly to the damage of her own legs and the paintwork, and after she had bitten a couple of 100 times, to the damage of Maid's neck and Charmian's temper. It was hard enough to have her favorite mare in the harness without also enduring the spectacle of its being eaten alive. Our leaders were joys. King being a polo pony and Milda a rabbit, they rounded curves beautifully and darted ahead like coyotes out of the way of the wheelers. Milda's besetting weakness was a frantic desire not to have the lead bar strike her hocks. When this happened, one of 3 things occurred: either she sat down on the lead bar, kicked it up in the air until she got her back under it, or exploded in a straight-ahead, harness-disrupting jump. Not until she carried the lead bar clean away and danced a breakdown on it and the traces, did she behave decently. Nokota and I made the repairs with good old-fashioned bale rope, which is stronger than wrought iron any time, and we went on our way. In the meantime I was learning I shall not say to tool a 4-in-hand but just simply to drive 4 horses. Now it is all right enough to begin with 4 workhorses pulling a load of several tons. But to begin with 4 light horses, all running, and a light rig that seems to outrun them well, when things happen they happen quickly. My weakness was total ignorance. In particular, my fingers lacked training, and I made the mistake of depending on my eyes to handle the reins. This brought me up against a disastrous optical illusion. The bite of the off-head line, being longer and heavier than that of the off-wheel line, hung lower. In a moment requiring quick action, I invariably mistook the 2 lines. Pulling on what I thought was the wheel line, in order to straighten the team, I would see the leaders swing abruptly around into a jack pole. Now for sensations of sheer impotence, nothing can compare with a jack pole, when the horrified driver beholds his leaders prancing gaily up the road and his wheelers jogging steadily down the road, all at the same time and all harnessed together and to the same rig. I no longer jack pole, and I don't mind admitting how I got out of the habit. It was my eyes that enslaved my fingers into ill practices. So I shut my eyes and let the fingers go it alone. Today my fingers are independent of my eyes and work automatically. I do not see what my fingers do. They just do it. All I see is the satisfactory result. Still we managed to get over the ground that first day down sunny Sonoma Valley to the old town of Sonoma, founded by General Vallejo as the remotest outpost on the northern frontier for the purpose of holding back the Gentiles, as the wild Indians of those days were called. Here history was made. Here the last Spanish mission was reared, here the bear flag was raised, and here Kit Carson, and Fremont, and all our early adventurers came and rested in the days before the days of gold. We swung on over the low, rolling hills, through miles of dairy farms and chicken ranches where every blessed hen is white, and down the slopes to Petaluma Valley. Here, in 1776, Captain Quiros came up Petaluma Creek from San Pablo Bay in quest of an outlet to Bodega Bay on the coast. And here, later, the Russians, with Alaskan hunters, carried skin boats across from Fort Ross to poach for sea otters on the Spanish preserve of San Francisco Bay. Here, too, still later, General Vallejo built a fort, which still stands one of the finest examples of Spanish adobe that remain to us. And here, at the old fort, to bring the chronicle up to date, our horses proceeded to make peculiarly personal history with astonishing success and dispatch. King, our peerless, polo pony leader, went lame. So hopelessly lame did he go that no expert, then and afterward, could determine whether the lameness was in his frogs, hoofs, legs, shoulders, or head. Maid picked up a nail and began to limp. Milder, figuring the day already sufficiently spent and maniacal with manger gluttony, began to rabbit jump. All that held her was the bail rope. And the outlaw, game to the last, exceeded all previous exhibitions of skin removing, paint marring, and horse eating. At Petaluma we rested over while King was returned to the ranch and Prince sent to us. Now Prince had proved himself an excellent wheeler, yet he had to go into the lead and let the outlaw retain his old place. There is an axiom that a good wheeler is a poor leader. I object to the last adjective. A good wheeler makes an infinitely worse kind of a leader than that. I know now. I ought to know. Since that day I have driven Prince a few hundred miles in the lead. He is neither any better nor any worse than the first mile he ran in the lead, and his worst is even extremely worse than what you are thinking. Not that he is vicious. He is merely a good-natured rogue who shakes hands for sugar, steps on your toes out of sheer excessive friendliness, and just goes on loving you in your harshest moments. But he won't get out of the way. Also, whenever he is reproved for being in the wrong, he accuses Milda of it and bites the back of her neck. So bad has this become that whenever I yell Prince, in a loud voice, Milda immediately rabbit jumps to the side, straight ahead, or sits down on the lead bar. All of which is quite disconcerting. Picture it yourself. You are swinging round a sharp, downgrade, mountain curve, at a fast trot. The rock wall is the outside of the curve. The inside of the curve is a precipice. The continuance of the curve is a narrow, unrailed bridge. You hit the curve, throwing the leaders in against the wall and making the polo horse do the work. All is lovely. The leaders are hugging the wall like nestling doves. But the moment comes in the evolution when the leaders must shoot out ahead. They really must shoot, or else they'll hit the wall and miss the bridge. Also, behind them are the wheelers, and the rig, and you have just eased the brake in order to put sufficient snap into the maneuver. If ever teamwork is required, now is the time. Milda tries to shoot. She does her best, but Prince, bubbling over with roguishness, lags behind. He knows the trick. Milda is half a length ahead of him. He times it to the fraction of a second. Maid, in the wheel, overrunning him, naturally bites him. This disturbs the outlaw, who has been behaving beautifully, and she immediately reaches across for Maid. Simultaneously, with a fine display of firm conviction that it's all Milda's fault, Prince sinks his teeth into the back of Milda's defenseless neck. The whole thing has occurred in less than a second. Under the surprise and pain of the bite, Milda either jumps ahead to the imminent peril of harness and lead bar, or smashes into the wall, stops short with the lead bar over her back, and emits a couple of hysterical kicks. The outlaw invariably selects this moment to remove paint. And after things are untangled and you have had time to appreciate the close shave, you go up to Prince and reprove him with your choicest vocabulary. And Prince, gazelle-eyed and tender, offers to shake hands with you for sugar. I leave it to anyone, a boat would never act that way. We have some history north of the bay. Nearly 3 centuries and a half ago, that doughty pirate and explorer, Sir Francis Drake, combing the Pacific for Spanish galleons, anchored in the bight formed by Point Reyes, on which today is one of the richest dairy regions in the world. Here, less than 2 decades after Drake, Sebastian Carmenin piled up on the rocks with a silk-laden galleon from the Philippines. And in this same Bay of Drake, long afterward, the Russian fur poachers rendezvoused their bidarkas and stole in through the Golden Gate to the forbidden waters of San Francisco Bay. Farther up the coast, in Sonoma County, we pilgrimaged to the sites of the Russian settlements. At Bodega Bay, south of what today is called Russian River, was their anchorage, while north of the river they built their fort. And much of Fort Ross still stands. Log bastions, church, and stables hold their own, and so well, with rusty hinges creaking, that we warmed ourselves at the 100-years-old double fireplace and slept under the hand-hewn roof beams still held together by spikes of hand-wrought iron. We went to see where history had been made, and we saw scenery as well. One of our stretches in a day's drive was from beautiful Inverness on Tomales Bay, down the Sonoma Valley to Bolinas Bay, along the eastern shore of that body of water to Willow Camp, and up over the sea bluffs, around the bastions of Tamalpais, and down to Sausalito. From the head of Bolinas Bay to Willow Camp the drive on the edge of the beach, and actually, for half-mile stretches, in the waters of the bay itself, was a delightful experience. The wonderful part was to come. Very few San Franciscans, much less Californians, know of that drive from Willow Camp, to the south and east, along the poppy-blown cliffs, with the sea thundering in the sheer depths hundreds of feet below and the Golden Gate opening up ahead, disclosing smoky San Francisco on her many hills. Far off, blurred on the breast of the sea, can be seen the Farallones, which Sir Francis Drake passed on ASW. Course in the thick of what he describes as a stinking fog. Well might he call it that, and a few other names, for it was the fog that robbed him of the glory of discovering San Francisco Bay. It was on this part of the drive that I decided at last I was learning real mountain driving. To confess the truth, for delicious titillation of one's nerve, I have since driven over no mountain road that was worse, or better, rather, than that piece. And then the contrast. From Sausalito, over excellent, park-like boulevards, through the splendid redwoods and homes of Mill Valley, across the blossomed hills of Marin County, along the knoll-studded picturesque marshes, past San Rafael resting warmly among her hills, over the divide and up the Petaluma Valley, and onto the grassy feet of Sonoma Mountain and home. We covered 55 miles that day. Not so bad, for Prince the Rogue, the paint-removing outlaw, the thin-shanked thoroughbred, and the rabbit jumper. And they came in cool and dry, ready for their mangers and the straw. Oh, we didn't stop. We considered we were just starting, and that was many weeks ago. We have kept on going over 6 counties which are comfortably large, even for California, and we are still going. We have twisted and tabled, crisscrossed our tracks, made fascinating and lengthy dives into the interior valleys in the hearts of Napa and Lake counties, traveled the coast for hundreds of miles on end, and are now in Eureka, on Humboldt Bay, which was discovered by accident by the gold seekers, who were trying to find their way to and from the Trinity diggings. Even here, the white man's history preceded them, for dim tradition says that the Russians once anchored here and hunted Seattle before the first Yankee trader rounded the Horn, or the first Rocky Mountain trapper thirsted across the great American desert and trickled down the snowy Sierras to the sun-kissed land. No, we are not resting our horses here on Humboldt Bay. We are writing this article, gorging on abalones and mussels, digging clams, and catching record-breaking sea trout and rock cod in the intervals in which we are not sailing, motorboating, and swimming in the most temperately equable climate we have ever experienced. These comfortably large counties. They are veritable empires. Take Humboldt, for instance. It is 3 times as large as Rhode Island, 1.5 times as large as Delaware, almost as large as Connecticut, and half as large as Massachusetts. The pioneer has done his work in this north of the Bay region, the foundations are laid, and all is ready for the inevitable inrush of population and adequate development of resources which so far have been no more than skimmed, and casually and carelessly skimmed at that. This region of the 6 counties alone will someday support a population of millions. In the meanwhile, oh you home seekers, you wealth seekers, and, above all, you climate seekers, now is the time to get in on the ground floor. Robert Ingersoll once said that the genial climate of California would in a fairly brief time evolve a race resembling the Mexicans, and that in 2 or 3 generations the Californians would be seen of a Sunday morning on their way to a cockfight with a rooster under each arm. Never was made a rasher generalization, based on so absolute an ignorance of facts. It is to laugh. Here is a climate that breeds vigor, with just sufficient geniality to prevent the expenditure of most of that vigor in fighting the elements. Here is a climate where a man can work 365 days in the year without the slightest hint of enervation, and where for 365 nights he must perforce sleep under blankets. What more can one say? I consider myself somewhat of climate expert, having adventured among most of the climates of 5 out of the 6 zones. I have not yet been in the Antarctic, but whatever climate obtains there will not deter me from drawing the conclusion that nowhere is there a climate to compare with that of this region. Maybe I am as wrong as Ingersoll was. Nevertheless, I take my medicine by continuing to live in this climate. Also, it is the only medicine I ever take. But to return to the horses. There is some improvement. Milda has actually learned to walk. Maid has proved her thoroughbredness by never tiring on the longest days, and, while being the strongest and highest-spirited of all, by never causing any trouble save for an occasional kick at the outlaw. And the outlaw rarely gallops, no longer butts, only periodically kicks, comes into the pole and does her work without attempting to vivisect Maid's medulla oblongata, and marvel of marvels is really and truly getting lazy. But Prince remains the same incorrigible, loving and lovable rogue he has always been. And the country we've been over. The drives through Napa and Lake counties. 1. From Sonoma Valley, via Santa Rosa, we could not refrain from taking several ways, and on all the ways we found the roads excellent for machines as well as horses. One route, and a more delightful one for an automobile cannot be found, is out from Santa Rosa, past Old Etruria and Mark West Springs, then to the right and across to Calistoga in Napa Valley. By keeping to the left, the drive holds on up the Russian River Valley, through the miles of the noted Asti vineyards to Cloverdale, and then by way of Pietà, Witter, and Highland Springs to Lakeport. Still another way we took, was down Sonoma Valley, skirting San Pablo Bay, and up the lovely Napa Valley. From Napa were side excursions through Pope and Berryessa valleys, on to Etna Springs, and still on, into Lake County, crossing the famous Langtry Ranch. Continuing up the Napa Valley, walled on either hand by great rock palisades and redwood forests and carpeted with endless vineyards, and crossing the many stone bridges for which the county is noted and which are joy to the beauty-loving eyes as well as to the 4-horse tyro driver, past Calistoga with its old mud baths and chicken soup springs, with St. Helena and its giant saddle ever towering before us, we climbed the mountains on a good grade and dropped down past the quicksilver mines. to the Canyon of the Geysers. After a stop overnight and an exploration of the miniature grand volcanic scene, we pulled on across the canyon and took the grade where the cicadas simmered audibly in the noon sunshine among the hillside manzanitas. Then, higher, came the big cattle-dotted upland pastures, and the rocky summit. And here on the summit, abruptly, we caught a vision, or what seemed a mirage. The ocean we had left long days before, yet far down and away shimmered a blue sea, framed on the farther shore by rugged mountains, on the near shore by fat and rolling farmlands. Clear Lake was before us, and like proper sailors we returned to our sea, going for a sail, a fish, and a swim ere the day was done and turning into tired Lakeport blankets in the early evening. Well has Lake County been called the walled-in county. But the railroad is coming. They say the approach we made to Clear Lake is similar to the approach to Lake Lucerne. Be that as it may, the scenery, with its distant snow-capped peaks, can well be called alpine. And what can be more exquisite than the drive out from Clear Lake to Ukiah by way of the Blue Lakes chain, every turn bringing into view a picture of breathless beauty, every glance backward revealing some perfect composition in line and color, the intense blue of the water margined with splendid oaks, green fields, and swaths of orange poppies. But those side glances and backward glances were provocative of trouble. Charmian and I disagreed as to which way the connecting stream of water ran. We still disagree, for at the hotel, where we submitted the affair to arbitration, the hotel manager and the clerk likewise disagreed. I assume, now, that we never will know which way that stream runs. Charmian suggests both ways. I refuse such a compromise. No stream of water I ever saw could accomplish that feat at one and the same time. The greatest concession I can make is that sometimes it may run one way and sometimes the other, and that in the meantime we should both consult an oculist. Moore Valley from Ukiah to Willets, and then we turned westward through the virgin Sherwood forest of magnificent redwood, stopping at Alpine for the night and continuing on through Mendocino County to Fort Bragg and Saltwater. We also came to Fort Bragg up the coast from Fort Ross, keeping our coast journey intact from the Golden Gate. The coast weather was cool and delightful, the coast driving superb. Especially in the Fort Ross section did we find the roads thrilling, while all the way along we followed the sea. At every stream, the road skirted dizzy cliff edges, dived down into lush growths of forest and ferns and climbed out along the cliff edges again. The way was lined with flowers, wild lilac, wild roses, poppies, and lupins. Such lupins, giant clumps of them, of every lupin shade and color. And it was along the Mendocino roads that Charmian caused many delays by insisting on getting out to pick the wild blackberries, strawberries, and thimbleberries which grew so profusely. And ever we caught peeps, far down, of steam schooners loading lumber in the rocky coves, ever we skirted the cliffs, day after day, crossing stretches of rolling farmlands and passing through thriving villages and sawmill towns. Memorable was our launch trip from Mendocino City up Big River, where the steering gears of the launches work the reverse of anywhere else in the world, where we saw a stream of logs, of 6 to 12 and 15 feet in diameter, which filled the river bed for miles to the obliteration of any sign of water, and where we were told of a white or albino redwood tree. We did not see this last, so cannot vouch for it. All the streams were filled with trout, and more than once we saw the sidehill salmon on the slopes. No, sidehill salmon is not a peripatetic fish, it is a deer out of season. But the trout! At Gualala Charmian caught her first one. Once before in my life I had caught two, on angleworms. On occasion I had tried fly and spinner and never got a strike, and I had come to believe that all this talk of fly fishing was just so much nature faking. But on the Gualala River I caught trout, a lot of them on fly and spinners, and I was beginning to feel quite an expert, until Nokota, fishing on bottom with a pellet of bread for bait, caught the biggest trout of all. I now affirm there is nothing in science nor in art. Nevertheless, since that day poles and baskets have been added to our baggage, we tackle every stream we come to, and we no longer are able to remember the grand total of our catch. At Usal, many hilly and picturesque miles north of Fort Bragg, we turned again into the interior of Mendocino, crossing the ranges and coming out in Humboldt County on the South Fork of Eel River at Garberville. Throughout the trip, from Marin County north, we had been warned of bad roads ahead. Yet we never found those bad roads. We seemed always to be just ahead of them or behind them. The farther we came, the better the roads seemed, though this was probably due to the fact that we were learning more and more what 4 horses and a light rig could do on a road. And thus do I save my face with all the counties. I refuse to make invidious road comparisons. I can add that while, save in rare instances on steep pitches, I have trotted my horses down all the grades, I have never had one horse fall down, nor have I had to send a rig to a blacksmith shop for repairs. Also, I am learning to throw leather. If any tyro thinks it is easy to take a short-handled, long-lashed whip, and throw the end of that lash just where he wants it, let him put on automobile goggles and try it. On reconsideration, I would suggest the substitution of a wire fencing mask for the goggles. For days I looked at that whip. It fascinated me, and the fascination was composed mostly of fear. At my first attempt, Charmian and Nokota became afflicted with the same sort of fascination, and for a long time afterward, whenever they saw me reach for the whip, they closed their eyes and shielded their heads with their arms. Here's the problem. Instead of pulling honestly, Prince is lagging back and maneuvering for a bite at Milda's neck. I have 4 reins in my hands. I must put these 4 reins into my left hand, properly gather the whip handle and the bite of the lash in my right hand, and throw that lash past Maid without striking her and into Prince. If the lash strikes Maid, her thoroughbredness will go up in the air, and I'll have a case of horse hysteria on my hands for the next half hour. But follow. The whole problem is not yet stated. Suppose that I miss Maid and reach the intended target. The instant the lash cracks, the 4 horses jump, Prince most of all, and his jump, with spread wicked teeth, is for the back of Milda's neck. She jumps to escape, which is her second jump, for the first one came when the lash exploded. The outlaw reaches for Maid's neck, and Maid, who has already jumped and tried to bolt, tries to bolt harder. And all this infinitesimal fraction of time I am trying to hold the 4 animals with my left hand, while my whiplash, writhing through the air, is coming back to me. 3 simultaneous things I must do: keep hold of the 4 reins with my left hand, slam on the brake with my foot, and on the rebound catch that flying lash in the hollow of my right arm and get the bite of it safely into my right hand. Then I must get 2 of the 4 lines back into my right hand and keep the horses from running away or going over the grade. Try it sometime. You will find life anything but wearisome. Why, the first time I hit the mark and made the lash go off like a revolver shot, I was so astounded and delighted that I was paralyzed. I forgot to do any of the multitudinous other things, tangled the whiplash in Maid's harness, and was forced to call upon Charmian for assistance. And now, confession. I carry a few pebbles handy. They're great for reaching Prince in a tight place. But just the same, I'm learning that whip every day, and before I get home I hope to discard the pebbles. And as long as I rely on pebbles, I cannot truthfully speak of myself as tooling a 4 in hand. From Garberville, where we ate eel to repletion and got acquainted with the Aborigines, we drove down the Eel River Valley for 2 days through the most unthinkably glorious body of redwood timber to be seen anywhere in California. From Dyerville on to Eureka, we caught glimpses of railroad construction and of great concrete bridges in the course of building, which advertised that at least Humboldt County was going to be linked to the rest of the world. We still consider our trip is just begun. As soon as this is mailed from Eureka, it's hee-ho for the horses and pull on. We shall continue up the coast, turn in for Hooper Reservation and the gold mines, and shoot down the Trinity and Klamath rivers in Indian canoes to Reka. After that, we shall go on through Del Norte County and into Oregon. The trip so far has justified us in taking the attitude that we won't go home until the winter rains drive us in. And, finally, I am going to try the experiment of putting the outlaw in the lead and relegating Prince to his old position in the near wheel. I won't need any pebbles then.